The dusty main street of Redemption Creek fell silent as 5 riders appeared on the horizon, their horses kicking up clouds that seemed to announce their arrival like a warning. Locals quickly cleared the wooden sidewalks, mothers ushering children inside, while old-timers watched with narrowed eyes from beneath weathered hat brims. These weren't the usual travelers or traders that passed through their peaceful town. The newcomers rode with a swagger that spoke of trouble. Young men with guns hanging low on their hips, faces unshaven, and eyes that sought out weakness like predators scanning a herd. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, dismounted first, spitting tobacco juice onto the dirt before gesturing toward the general store. "Boys, let's see what this pathetic excuse for a town has to offer," he drawled, his voice carrying down the street as his companions laughed. Inside Mason's general store, the atmosphere shifted immediately as the drifters pushed through the door, bell jingling a warning to the patrons within. Old Mr. Mason stood behind his counter, hands nervously adjusting his spectacles as the young gunslingers began wandering through the aisles, picking up items and tossing them carelessly aside. "Can I help you gentlemen find something?" Mason asked, his voice betraying his unease. The leader, Cole Draper was the name he'd give later, leaned against the counter, his leather vest creaking as he moved. "Just browsing, old man. Don't get your long johns in a twist." At the back of the store, seated on a barrel of flour near the potbelly stove, sat Josiah Kane. His weathered hands, marked with the calluses of 50 years working the land, cradled a cup of coffee. His eyes, sharp despite his 70 years, watched the scene unfold without expression. Kane had seen their type before, young, dangerous, and stupid, a deadly combination. One of the drifters noticed Kane watching them and nudged his companion. "Look at this fossil," he snickered, sauntering over to where Kane sat. "What are you looking at, Grandpa? Reminiscing about the Civil War?" Kane took another sip of his coffee, not dignifying the mockery with a response. His silence seemed to irritate the young troublemaker further. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," the drifter pressed, flicking Kane's hat. "Are you deaf as well as decrepit?" The entire store had gone quiet now, tension building like a thunderstorm. Mason's daughter, Sarah, a young woman of 20, tried to defuse the situation by offering the men free coffee, but as she approached, one of them grabbed her wrist. "I'd prefer something sweeter than coffee, darlin'," he leered, pulling her closer. Ever heard stories about old-timers surprising the young bloods? Well, stick around. This one's a legend in the making. "Or what, old man?" The drifter tightened his grip on Sarah's wrist, making her wince. His confidence swelled, bolstered by his friend's laughter. "You gonna hobble over here and stop me?" Kane stood slowly, his movements deliberate but fluid. Too fluid for a man his age. The chair leg didn't scrape the floor, his hands didn't tremble. He simply rose like a mountain shifting. Before Kane could approach, Cole Draper stepped forward, shoving the old rancher back against the barrel. Kane stumbled slightly but caught himself with a steadiness that didn't match his apparent frailty. "Sit down before you hurt yourself," Draper sneered, turning to the storekeeper. "Mason, right? Got any decent whiskey in this dump?" Mason's face had gone pale, but not from Draper's intimidation. He was looking past the drifters at Kane, who was straightening his worn leather vest with disturbing calm. "Gentlemen," Mason said carefully, "perhaps you should—" "Perhaps they should do what, Thomas?" Kane interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet danger. An elderly customer near the door, Ezekiel Thompson, who'd been silently watching the scene unfold, suddenly coughed out a name that made the room grow even quieter. One of the younger drifters, a wiry man with a patchy beard, froze mid-step. His eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Kane? Josiah Kane, the bounty hunter?" he asked, taking an involuntary step backward. "The one they called the Reaper?" Draper let out a derisive laugh, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "This old goat? The legendary Kane?" He turned to the old rancher with mock reverence. "Well, I'm honored. Boys, we're in the presence of greatness. If you believe the fairy tales..." The wiry drifter wasn't laughing. "Boss, I've heard stories about this man. If he's who they say—" "He's a washed-up nobody," Draper cut him off, then faced Kane directly. "If you're so legendary, prove it. I challenge you, right now. Let's see what the famous Reaper can do." Kane's weathered face remained impassive as he looked Draper in the eye. "I don't fight fools," he said simply, turning to leave. The saloon doors swung open as Kane stepped into the dimly lit establishment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards, highlighting the trail of dust following his steady footsteps. Behind him, the drifters had finally left the general store, Mason's relieved sigh still hanging in the air as they scattered into town like a virus spreading through a vulnerable body. Kane settled at a corner table, nodding to the barkeep, who immediately brought over a glass of whiskey without being asked. News traveled fast in Redemption Creek, faster than the drifters could swagger down its main street. "Trouble's brewing, Josiah," the barkeep muttered, wiping down the table. "Those boys have been asking questions about you since they left Mason's." Kane took a measured sip of his whiskey. "Let them ask." Across the saloon, Sheriff Bill Miller nursed his coffee, watching Kane with knowing eyes. They'd ridden together once, decades ago, before Kane had hung up his guns and Miller had pinned on a star. The sheriff made his way over, coffee cup in hand, and eased into the chair opposite his old friend. "I heard what happened at Mason's," Miller said quietly. "Draper and his boys aren't just passing through. They've been running a protection racket in Cottonwood and Harrisburg. 3 men are dead already." "It might be," Miller countered, leaning forward. "Draper's got a reputation for holding grudges, and his right hand, the jumpy one called Jenkins, he's killed 11 men in duels, or ambushes, depending on who you ask." A commotion at the bar interrupted their conversation. The drifters had arrived, already half drunk from their visit to the smaller saloon down the street. They commandeered the bar, shoving aside the regular patrons with loud curses and threats. Ezekiel Thompson, the old-timer from the general store, had unfortunately chosen that moment to order a drink. Draper spotted him and grabbed him by his collar. "You're the one who called out Kane's name like he was some kind of legend," Draper snarled, breath heavy with cheap whiskey. "Tell us about this supposed Reaper before I put you in the ground." The old man trembled but found his voice. "It ain't just stories. Kane brought in the Maddox gang single-handed in '68. All 7 of them. 5 dead, 2 alive, but wishing they weren't." "That true, Sheriff?" one of the drifters called out to Miller. The sheriff nodded slowly. "That and more. The Blackwood brothers, Silas Creedy, Rattlesnake Washington. Kane hunted them all. 37 confirmed kills, 22 brought in alive. Most dangerous man I ever rode with." Draper laughed, but Jenkins and the others exchanged uneasy glances. "You believe that horse shit?" Draper mocked. "Look at him, just a worn-out old saddle tramp now." Kane finished his whiskey and stood to leave, moving past the drifters without acknowledgement. Draper, incensed by the dismissal, grabbed a bottle and smashed it against the bar. "I'm talking to you, Reaper!" he shouted. But Kane was already gone, the saloon doors swinging in his wake. Hours later, as darkness settled over Redemption Creek, one of Draper's men, a young hothead named Simmons, staggered drunk toward the edge of town, where Kane's modest ranch sat silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The ranch house was dark as Simmons approached, his alcohol-addled brain convinced he was moving with stealth. He never noticed the shadow that detached itself from the porch rocker, never heard the soft creak of weathered floorboards, never sensed the presence behind him until it was too late. Simmons fumbled with the back door latch, cursing under his breath as his drunken fingers slipped on the simple mechanism. The moonlight cast just enough light for him to see his way into what appeared to be Kane's kitchen. A few embers still glowed in the stove, casting an eerie red glow across the modest room. "Let's see what the famous Reaper has hidden away," Simmons whispered to himself, his booze-soaked brain convinced he was being clever. He began rifling through drawers, pocketing a silver spoon and an old pocket watch. The floorboard behind him creaked, so softly it might have been the house settling. But houses don't settle with rhythm, like footsteps. Before Simmons could turn, a hand clamped over his mouth while another twisted his gun arm behind his back with surprising strength. The young drifter felt himself being forced to his knees, his revolver plucked from his holster with casual ease. "Searching for something?" Kane's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he released Simmons and stepped back. Simmons scrambled to his feet, turning to face the old rancher. In the dim red glow, Kane seemed taller somehow, his shadow stretching across the kitchen wall like something from a nightmare. The young man's hand went instinctively for his missing gun. "Looking for this?" Kane held up Simmons' revolver, examining it with expert eyes. "Poor balance. Trigger's too stiff. You'd be dead in a real gunfight." I wasn't..." Simmons stammered, suddenly sober enough to realize his terrible mistake. Kane stepped closer, and Simmons noticed something that made his blood run cold. The old man moved like a predator. No wasted motion, no trembling hands or uncertain steps. His eyes reflected the ember's glow, sharp and calculating. "Do you know how many men have tried to kill me in my sleep?" Kane asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. 53. You would have been 54. With a flick of his wrist, Kane emptied the bullets from Simmons' gun, letting them clatter onto the wooden floor. He then tossed the empty weapon back to its owner, who fumbled the catch. "I could kill you right now," Kane continued, "and no one in this town would question it. Self-defense. But I made a promise years ago, no more killing unless absolutely necessary." He moved to the door and opened it, gesturing for Simmons to leave. "Tell Draper what happened here tonight. Tell him that next time, I might not be feeling so nostalgic about my promises." Simmons bolted through the door, nearly tripping down the porch steps in his haste to escape. Kane watched him run, disappearing into the night like a scared rabbit before a wolf. Back at the saloon, Draper and the remaining drifters were still drinking, boasting about their exploits to the few patrons desperate enough to feign interest. When Simmons burst through the doors, pale and shaking, the laughter died quickly. "What happened to you?" Draper demanded, taking in his companion's terrified expression. "Kane, Simmons struggled to find words. "He caught me. I never even heard him coming. 1 second I was alone, the next he had me on my knees." "And yet here you are, still breathing," Jenkins observed quietly. "He let me go," Simmons admitted. "Said he made a promise not to kill unless necessary. But his eyes, boss. It wasn't an old man looking at me. It was the Reaper." Draper's face darkened with fury. "You yellow-bellied coward! Scared off by some ancient lawman?" "You weren't there," Simmons insisted. "He moved like nothing I've ever seen." Redemption Creek's main street baked under the midday sun as townspeople went about their business with unusual caution. Word of the encounter at Kane's ranch had spread through town like wildfire, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Everyone could feel it, a storm brewing, just waiting to break. Kane emerged from the general store, a small package of supplies tucked under his arm. He'd nearly reached his horse when Draper's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Kane!" The drifter stood in the middle of the street, flanked by his 4 companions. Their hands hovered near their holsters, faces set with false bravado. "Time to settle this, old man." Kane turned slowly, regarding the group with calm assessment. The street cleared quickly as shoppers and merchants retreated to doorways and alleyways, eager to witness but not participate. "There's nothing to settle," Kane replied, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "Go on your way, and I'll go on mine." Draper stepped forward, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "Not how it works. You humiliated my man last night. That means you've humiliated me." Sheriff Miller emerged from his office, hand resting on his holstered gun, but Kane gave him a subtle gesture to stay back. "Last chance," Kane warned, setting his package down on a nearby hitching post. "Walk away before this goes somewhere you can't return from." Draper laughed, but the sound was hollow. You hear that, boys? The famous Reaper is giving us a chance to leave." He turned back to Kane, all pretense of humor vanishing. "Tomorrow, high noon, right here in the street. We'll see if the legend matches the man." An elderly woman stepped forward from the gathering crowd, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the boarding house. "Young man, you have no idea who you're challenging," she warned, her voice quivering with age and anxiety. "Stay out of this, Grandma," Jenkins snapped, though his eyes never left Kane's steady gaze. 24 hours, old man," Draper declared. "Be here or we burn your ranch to the ground." Kane picked up his package as casually as if he'd just been invited to Sunday dinner. "I'll be here," he said simply, "but not for the reason you think." As the drifters swaggered away, the townsfolk converged around Kane, voices tumbling over each other with concerns and warnings. He silenced them with a raised hand. "Go about your business," he advised. "Tomorrow will take care of itself." "Figured you'd come," Kane said without looking up, his weathered hands working the cloth over the cylinder with practiced precision. Miller dismounted with a grunt, tying his horse to the rail before climbing the steps. "You don't have to do this, Josiah. I can run them out of town tonight. Official business." Kane smiled faintly. "And have they come back with more men? Or take their frustration out on the next town?" "No, Bill. Some things need finishing." The sheriff settled into the chair beside Kane, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Been 30 years since I saw you use that," he said, nodding toward the revolver. "That's right," Miller nodded, memories flooding back. 3 of them, as I recall. You got all 3 before I even cleared leather." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 old warriors sharing the weight of shared history. Kane's hands paused their work. "You remember Martha Elkins, the school teacher?" "Course I do, pretty woman, soft-spoken." "Before she died," Kane said quietly, "I made her a promise. Said I'd watch over this town. Said I'd put down roots, build something instead of just taking lives." He resumed cleaning the gun. "More importantly, I promised her I'd never kill again unless there was absolutely no other choice." Miller studied his old friend's face, noting the deep lines carved by sun and sorrow alike. "Those boys tomorrow, they won't give you a choice." Kane slid the cylinder back into place with a satisfying click. "There's always a choice, Bill. Always." "What if they don't back down? What if they draw on you?" As Miller rode back toward town, he glanced over his shoulder to see Kane still sitting there, a solitary figure silhouetted against the warm light from the window. For a brief moment, the sheriff didn't see the aging rancher, but the deadly hunter of men he once rode with. The legend that still haunted campfire stories across the frontier. High noon in Redemption Creek brought an eerie silence. The usual bustle of commerce had ceased, windows were shuttered, and the doors of the saloon, normally wide open to welcome thirsty patrons, remained firmly closed. Only the occasional creak of a windmill and the distant bark of a dog broke the stillness. Townspeople lined the boardwalks, keeping to the shadows while maintaining clear sight lines to the dusty main street. Children who'd normally been playing between errands were conspicuously absent, all except young Tommy Wilson, who'd climbed to a rooftop for a better view despite his mother's frantic whispers to come down. At one end of the street, Draper and his men emerged from the saloon. They spread out in a loose formation, Draper taking center position while Jenkins and the others flanked him. Their faces were grim, eyes bloodshot from a night of drinking liquid courage. "Where is he?" Simmons muttered, nervously scanning the street. As if in answer, Kane appeared at the opposite end, walking with unhurried purpose. The crowd collectively held its breath. This wasn't the stooped rancher they were used to seeing. Kane walked tall, shoulders squared, his weathered face set in lines of determination. Yet something was missing. "He's not wearing a gun," someone whispered in disbelief. It was true. Kane wore no holster, no revolver at his hip. He simply walked to the middle of the street and stopped, hands visible at his sides, waiting. Draper's confident smirk faltered. "What kind of game are you playing, old man?" "No game," Kane replied, his voice carrying across the silent street. "I'm giving you one last chance to ride out. No shame in it. Just turn around and leave this town in peace." Laughter rippled among the drifters, though it sounded forced. "You came to a gunfight unarmed?" Draper called, recovering his bravado. "Either you're senile or you've got a death wish." Kane's expression remained unchanged. "I've killed enough men to last several lifetimes. I promised someone important I wouldn't kill again unless absolutely necessary." His eyes hardened. "So far, this doesn't qualify as necessary." Draper's face flushed with rage. "You arrogant old fool!" His hand dropped to his holster, fingers closing around the grip of his revolver. What happened next occurred so quickly that many witnesses later disagreed on the exact sequence. Kane seemed to blur forward, covering the distance between them with shocking speed. As Draper's gun cleared leather, Kane's hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting with such precise force that the revolver discharged harmlessly into the dirt before falling from nerveless fingers. In the same fluid motion, Kane's other hand struck Draper's throat. Not hard enough to crush his windpipe, but with sufficient precision to leave the younger man gasping and on his knees. "That's not possible," Jenkins whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. Chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Jenkins recovered from his shock first, drawing his revolver with practiced speed, but Kane was already moving. The old bounty hunter pivoted away from the kneeling Draper and closed the distance to Jenkins in 3 rapid strides. Before the gun could level at his chest, Kane's hand shot out, fingers finding pressure points in Jenkins's wrist that sent painful shocks up his arm. The gun clattered to the dirt as Jenkins howled in agony, dropping to one knee. Kane's follow-up strike was almost gentle, a precise tap to the side of the neck that sent Jenkins sprawling unconscious beside his weapon. The remaining 3 drifters stood frozen in disbelief before instinct took over. Simmons broke first, turning to flee toward the horses tied outside the saloon. The townspeople, emboldened by Kane's display, moved to block his escape. Mr. Mason from the general store stepped forward with a shotgun, while the blacksmith and several ranchers formed a human barrier. "Going somewhere?" Mason asked, his earlier fear replaced by stern resolve. The 2 other drifters, panicking now, drew their weapons simultaneously. Kane moved between them with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his hands becoming weapons more precise than any gun. One moment both men were standing with revolvers drawn. The next they were on the ground, one clutching a dislocated shoulder, the other trying to breathe through bruised ribs. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. A flicker of movement from the saloon porch caught Sheriff Miller's attention. The youngest drifter, a boy barely 20 who'd stayed back during the challenge, was raising a rifle, his sights trained on Kane's back. The sheriff's revolver cleared leather in a practiced draw, but he hesitated, unwilling to kill someone so young. Instead, Miller fired a warning shot that splintered the wooden post beside the young man's head. The rifle clattered to the porch as the boy raised his hands in surrender. Kane stood in the center of the street, surrounded by the fallen drifters. His breathing remained steady, his movements precise as he collected their scattered weapons. Nothing in his demeanor suggested a man of 70. This was the Reaper in his element, efficient and controlled. Draper, still on his knees and struggling for breath, looked up at Kane with a mixture of fear and hatred. Blood trickled from his split lip, and his right wrist hung at an awkward angle. Not broken, but sprained badly enough to ensure he wouldn't be drawing a gun anytime soon. "Your reputation," Draper gasped, "doesn't do you justice." Kane regarded him impassively. "That's because most who've seen what I can really do aren't alive to talk about it." A crowd had gathered around the fallen drifters, townsfolk emerging from doorways and alleyways now that the danger had passed. Kane stood at the center of this impromptu circle, his posture relaxed, yet somehow still vigilant. Sheriff Miller approached, holstering his revolver. "What now, Josiah?" he asked quietly. Kane looked down at Draper, who was nursing his injured wrist with murder still burning in his eyes. Despite his defeat, defiance radiated from the young gunslinger. "You have two choices," Kane said, his voice carrying to every ear on the street. "First option, you and your men leave town immediately. Never return to Redemption Creek or any settlement within 100 miles. Draper spat blood onto the dirt. "And the second option?" Kane's expression remained unchanged, but something deadly flickered behind his eyes. "You can start digging. 5 graves shouldn't take more than a day if you all work together." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Miller looked surprised. "You said you wouldn't kill unless necessary," the sheriff reminded him quietly. "I'm not planning to," Kane replied. "Just offering them a choice." One of the drifters who'd been nursing his dislocated shoulder struggled to his feet. "I've had enough," he announced. "Count me out, Draper. I didn't sign up to die today." He turned to Kane with grudging respect. "I'll take the first option, mister." Jenkins, now conscious but groggy, nodded his agreement. "Me too. Ain't no score worth this." Draper looked around at his crumbling gang, the humiliation of defeat etched into his features. For a moment, it seemed he might choose death over dishonor. His hand twitched toward his boot where a small knife remained hidden. Kane noticed. "That would be unwise," he said softly. Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of what would follow, finally broke through Draper's pride. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll go." Kane nodded to Sheriff Miller, who began organizing several deputies to escort the drifters to the town limits. The townspeople watched in silence as the 5 men collected their horses, none of them making eye contact with the citizens they'd terrorized just a day earlier. Before mounting, Draper turned to Kane one last time. "This isn't over," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Kane stepped closer, speaking so only Draper could hear. "Yes, it is. Because if I ever see your face again, I won't be honoring any promises." He tapped Draper's injured wrist lightly, causing the younger man to wince. "And I know at least 48 ways to kill a man that make this pain feel like a gentle caress." The blood drained from Draper's face as he recognized the truth in Kane's eyes. Without another word, he mounted his horse and led his defeated gang out of Redemption Creek. Evening settled over Redemption Creek like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it a sense of peace that had been absent during the drifters' stay. The saloon buzzed with animated conversations as townspeople recounted what they'd witnessed, each telling more elaborate than the last. Kane sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and crimson. The events of the day seemed distant already, like a story that had happened to someone else. He'd hung up his guns years ago, wanting nothing more than to live out his days in peace, yet trouble had found him anyway. It always did. A horse approached along the winding path to his ranch, the rider's silhouette familiar against the darkening sky. Sheriff Miller dismounted with a groan, his joints complaining after a long day. "Thought you might want to know," Miller said, climbing the steps to join Kane. "Draper and his boys crossed the county line an hour ago. Deputies watched them until they were just specks on the horizon." Kane nodded, offering Miller a glass of whiskey from the bottle beside him. "Town's talking about nothing else," Miller continued after a grateful sip. "By next week, the story will have you taking on 20 men with your bare hands." A rare smile crossed Kane's weathered face. "Legends grow taller with each telling." "Young Deputy Collins couldn't stop asking questions all afternoon," Miller chuckled. "Wanted to know if you'd teach him some of those moves. Boys practically worship the ground you walk on now." They sat in companionable silence, sipping whiskey as stars began appearing in the velvet sky above. "Ryder came into town just after sundown," Miller finally said. "Stranger, well-dressed, asking questions about you." Kane's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "What kind of questions?" "About whether the stories were true. About what happened today." Miller studied his old friend carefully. Said his name was Harrison, James Harrison. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. "Edmund Harrison's son?" Kane asked, his voice carefully neutral. Kane sighed deeply, memories washing over him like shadows. Edmund Harrison had been a notorious gang leader whom Kane had brought to justice decades ago, the last man he'd killed before hanging up his guns. The bounty had set Kane up for life, but it had come with a price, a dying promise to a schoolteacher and a blood feud with the Harrison family. "Some ghosts," Kane said quietly, "never stop haunting you." Miller finished his whiskey and stood to leave. "What will you do?" Kane's eyes drifted to the horizon where the first stars were appearing, bright pinpricks in the gathering darkness. "What I always do, Bill. Face whatever comes." News traveled fast in the West, carried by stagecoach drivers, telegraph operators, and drifters seeking shelter and a hot meal in exchange for the latest gossip. Within days, the story of what had happened in Redemption Creek reached neighboring towns, each retelling more fantastic than the last. In Cooperville, 40 miles east, a saloon fell silent when a traveler mentioned Josiah Kane's name. In Westridge, traders whispered about how the legendary Reaper had disarmed 5 men without drawing a gun. By the time the tale reached Silver Junction, Kane had become a mythic figure who could stop bullets with a glance. Back in Redemption Creek, life had mostly returned to normal. Kane continued his quiet existence, tending his small herd of cattle and occasionally visiting town for supplies. If he noticed the changed way people looked at him, a mixture of awe, respect, and nervous reverence, he gave no indication. At Mason's General Store, business was booming. Travelers began making detours just to visit the place where Kane had faced down the drifters. Mason himself had become an unofficial historian, recounting the confrontation to anyone who would listen. "You should have seen him move," Mason told a wide-eyed freight hauler as he measured out coffee beans. "Like lightning in a bottle. 1 minute Draper's drawing his gun, the next he's on his knees gasping for air." Kane entered the store during this retelling, causing an immediate hush to fall over the customers. Mason faltered mid-sentence, looking embarrassed at being caught embellishing the story yet again. "Morning, Thomas," Kane said calmly, placing his list on the counter as if nothing had happened. "Need a few things today." "Of course, Mr. Kane," Mason replied, shooting a meaningful look at the other customers who were staring openly. "Right away, sir." As Mason gathered the items, Kane turned to the freight hauler. "Don't believe everything you hear," he said quietly. "Stories tend to grow taller than cornfields in summer." The man nodded nervously. "Yes, sir, Mr. Kane." When Kane had paid for his supplies and left, conversation exploded back to life. The freight hauler now had his own story to tell, how he'd spoken with the legendary Reaper himself. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Miller found Kane sitting outside the barber shop, waiting his turn for a trim. "You know," Miller said, settling into the chair beside him, "you're single-handedly boosting our local economy. Haven't seen this many visitors since they thought they'd found gold in Carson's Creek." Kane's weathered face creased in a small smile. "Not my intention." "Intention or not, people respect you," Miller replied. "Every troublemaker between here and the territory line has heard what happened. Might be the most peaceful summer we've had in years." Kane gazed down the busy street, watching townspeople go about their business without fear. Then something good came of it after all. The horizon swallowed the 5 riders as they disappeared into the painted vastness of the western landscape. Draper rode in the lead, his back rigid with humiliation, his injured wrist carefully cradled against his chest. Behind him, his once loyal gang maintained a respectful distance, their former camaraderie fractured by defeat and resentment. 3 days of hard riding had carried them far from Redemption Creek, yet not far enough to escape the shadow of what had happened there. Each night around the campfire, silence replaced their usual boasts and laughter. No one mentioned Kane or their humiliation, but the old bounty hunter's presence haunted them like a ghost. Draper whirled on him, eyes flashing with barely contained rage. "You yellow-bellied coward! One old man gets the drop on us, and you're ready to tuck tail and run?" "One old man?" Simmons interjected, his voice edged with disbelief. "That wasn't just some rancher. That was Josiah Kane, the Reaper himself. We're lucky to be alive." "Shut up!" Draper snarled. but his authority had evaporated like morning dew under a merciless sun. "I'm heading south," the youngest drifter announced, already mounting his horse. "My cousin's got work in Arizona territory. Honest work." He looked pointedly at Draper. "I've had my fill of dying for someone else's pride." One by one, the others declared their intentions. Separate paths, different territories, new beginnings. Only Jenkins lingered, watching Draper with a mixture of pity and wariness. "What about you?" Draper demanded. "Got somewhere better to be?" Jenkins sighed, absently rubbing his wrist where Kane's fingers had found pressure points none of them knew existed. "That old man could have killed us all, Cole. Should have, by rights. But he gave us a chance instead." "A chance?" Draper spat. "He humiliated us." "He taught us something," Jenkins countered. "There's always someone faster, someone deadlier. We've been lucky riding roughshod over small towns where nobody stood up to us. But Kane," he shook his head, "Kane showed us what real skill looks like, what real danger is." As Jenkins mounted up, he looked back at his former leader one last time. "Take the gift he gave you, Cole. Ride away. Start fresh somewhere. Because men like Kane, they're the law of nature out here. They remind the likes of us that there are consequences." Left alone in the empty campsite, Draper's thoughts turned dark as storm clouds. His gun hand throbbed with phantom pain, a constant reminder of his failure. Part of him longed for revenge, to return to Redemption Creek with enough men to burn it to the ground. But deeper than his anger, in a place he rarely acknowledged, lurked something new: fear. He could still see Kane's eyes, ancient, knowing, deadly. Not the eyes of a man who was bluffing or exaggerating. They were the eyes of someone who had seen death and delivered it so many times that it had become a familiar companion. Back at his ranch, Kane sat on his porch watching the same sunset that painted the distant figures of the scattered drifters. Something in him knew that Draper, at least, was contemplating return and revenge. But he also knew the man had seen enough to understand the truth. "Some men learn too late," Kane murmured to the empty evening air, rocking gently in his chair as darkness claimed the land. "And some never learn at all." If you thought this story was crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our videos.